Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is Troy with Cichlid Bros. In today's video, we are talking all about keeping your aquarium clear of algae, how to prevent it in the first place, and how to get it off of all your panels, including the back panel, using products like this one from Flipper. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks on how to use these effectively so that you don't scratch your aquarium, break any seals in the corner, and just get all the panels off so that your water and your tank look great. So before we talk about this trio of products from Flipper, let's talk about what causes aquarium algae in the first place. It's pretty simple because all aquariums will get algae, but if you have excess lighting or a buildup of nutrients in your tank, you're likely to have much more algae growing and potentially making your tank look bad. So if you're dealing with a lot of algae growing in your aquarium, I would definitely recommend reducing the lighting or dimming the lighting, just in general reducing the amount of exposure that your tank has to bright light. And then second, I would test your waters regularly to see where your nitrates are. If they're building up to 20 to 40 parts per million or more, your algae is definitely going to start to grow even if your lighting schedule is reduced. And if your nitrates are consistently high, I would recommend more water changes, more live plants, or checking to see how much you're feeding your aquarium. If you're overfeeding, that can definitely contribute to high nitrates in the tank. But even if you reduce your lighting and stay on top of your nitrates, it's very likely you'll still have a little bit of algae grow, a little bit of biofilm, especially on the panels of your tanks. And to me, the priority is scrubbing off the algae from the front viewing panel and also the two sides. But one thing that people forget about a lot is the back panel, because it is harder to reach that. But with one of the products I'm going to show from Flipper, you can easily do that without really getting on top of the tank or getting your arm all the way down into the aquarium. And obviously the main thing is scrubbing off that algae from your viewing panels so that your tank looks great and crystal clear. I don't mind when algae builds up a little bit on my decor, as long as it is not on the viewing panels and glass. So I have always used the Flipper scrubbers. This is the Flipper Float. It comes in many different sizes, which I'll talk about in a second, but it has a lot of cool functionalities, so you don't ever have to get your hand wet or into the tank. You could just walk by your tank, do a quick wipe down, and then it looks great. And as long as you're staying on top of that, the algae won't really build up and get calcified on the tank. And sometimes you won't even realize that biofilm is on your viewing panel unless you look at it from the side. My 150-gallon custom aquarium here always looks crystal clear, and I love this tank. But as you can see, it does have a little bit of biofilm on that front panel, and I'm using the soft matte side of this Flipper Float. But one of the coolest things about this is that it does have a blade side, so if you have some really tough algae, you can just do a little flip. I'll show it right here, and then the blade is much stronger against some of that tougher algae that wouldn't come off with the matting alone. I've used some algae scrapers in the past, like this one. It's like a nameless brand, or some of the cheaper ones, and they just don't last as long as the Flipper Floats. Their matting isn't as good and as strong, and sometimes the suction just isn't strong enough on some of these cheaper ones, and it falls out into the tank. Another cool thing about the Flipper Float is that that happens, it floats in the tank and you can just easily push it back towards the glass. When I've shown the Flipper Float in action in videos, some people have commented that they wouldn't want a blade sticking out where a fish could potentially swim into it and harm themselves. I've never had that issue, but if you're really worried about it, just make sure you flip it back to where the blade is pointing towards the glass and you should have no issues. Like I said, I've used Flipper Floats for many years. I've had a few of them for 5+ years, and they work just as good as they did on day one. Another cool thing is, as you're using this, you could wipe off the front panel. You could use the blade to scrape off some of that harder algae, but you can also go around the corner, and the magnet is strong enough that it can just go straight over into the side panels, and you could do the same thing. Another frequent question I get is, when I'm using the Flipper Float, how do I not scratch my aquarium? Well, there are a few tips and tricks I would suggest to protect your tank from any type of scratching or damage. First of all, anytime I go to use it, I just gently raise up the outside part and just look at it to see if there's any type of debris, sand, snails, anything that is between the scraper and the glass. The other thing is, I would recommend just short back and forth motions, nothing that's too long and sweeping, because that blade could scrape across the glass if you do it too fast or too far. Another thing is, if you are scraping down by the substrate, just be very careful. If you are disturbing that substrate, it's very possible to be getting up between the magnet cleaner and the glass. So again, if you're doing near the substrate, I would just take a little quick peek, make sure no sand or debris got there, and then you should be good. Also, if you're doing the short and steady strokes, you can kind of feel or hear if there's any type of debris in there, and then you could act quickly before any actual damage happens to your tank. And if there's ever a lot of algae that's grown on the glass and I'm scraping it off, if I'm doing a water change at that same time, it's really ideal because you can get some of that debris and algae and just suck it out of your aquarium so that it's not just accumulating either in your filter or sand bed. But if you are doing a water change or your water level is a little bit lower, be very careful if you're moving the flipper outside of the water level. Sometimes it could be a bit more rough if you go above the water level during a water change, for instance, so just be very careful about that. And the last thing to watch out for is the seams of your aquarium. Using my custom aquarium as an example, these are extremely durable, thick beads of silicone, but even Custom Aquariums has told us to be careful using flippers or any other types of magnet floaters, because if you're going directly into that silicone, especially with the blade, it will probably be okay, but you just don't want to be doing it too aggressively near the seam. So anytime I'm going near the corners of my aquariums, I'm just extra careful. I just do a little bit shorter of strokes and just make sure I'm not slamming into that silicone, and you should be just fine. And like I said before, a lot of people forget to do the back panel of their glass because you can't really go all the way around with the flipper float. But if you use the flipper platinum scraper, you can easily get that back panel. You can especially get the back bottom where it's really hard to get off some of that algae, especially if you're not going all the way into your tank or over there and you're getting your entire arm wet. This is a really good tool just to scrape that off quickly and effectively, and it's part of the trio of flipper products that I recommend with the float, the scraper, and the flip mitt, which we'll show in a second. All of the flipper floats and the platinum algae scrapers have replaceable end pieces if you ever need to. Like I said, I've used mine for years and never had to actually replace parts, but they are on the site if you ever need it. Another thing to consider is your glass thickness so that you don't buy the wrong size. The Flipper Nano goes up to about 25 gallons, which would be about 1/4 inch thickness. And then the Flipper Float, the next size up, goes to a 1/2 inch in glass thickness. So that's what I use on my 90 gallon, my 150, my 135, and on my 500 gallon tank, because that has a 1/2 inch glass panel as well. But if you have a really big tank, you could do the Flipper Max, which goes up to 3/4 inches of thickness. And I used that on Damien Cotter's tank, his big discus tank, since the glass panel is really thick. But now that you have cleared off all the algae from your viewing panels and the back glass as well, one thing people forget to do a lot is clearing off the outside of the glass. So I actually have started to use the flip mitt, and you'll start to see a theme here with the flipper products. It's actually a trio bundle that I'll link down below, and the flip mitt's actually a pretty useful tool because before I would just use whatever towels I had laying around in my fish room, but I would be using those for other things as well, and then they get dirty. So I know with the flip mitt, this is only used to clean the outside of my aquarium glass. So it's really simple. There are a lot of glass cleaner brands, or you could DIY glass cleaner. Just don't use anything like Windex because that could potentially get in your tank and be harmful to your fish. But if you have aquarium safe cleaner, just spray it on the outside, wipe it down with your towel, or in this case the flip mitt, making sure you get all those fingerprints, watermarks, and smudges off the outside of your glass, and then everything in your tank will look pristine. So in summary, we walked through how to prevent algae in the first place, but if you do get some in your aquarium, especially on your outside panels, how to effectively get them off with tools and using those tools effectively. It is what I would always recommend because it is what I have used for many years. It's lasted a long time and I've never had issues. Just be careful using these products and following some of those tips and tricks I mentioned throughout the video, and your glass panels will be looking immaculate without scratches and without algae. So I hope you found that video helpful or interesting. Thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.